Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at new medical techniques. We've looked at who helped the sick. We've even looked at some of the ways that they were helped. And we've also had a look at advances in surgery in some of my other rapid revision videos. But these are the ones I've not yet covered, so it's worth seeing this too. One of the problems was with broken bones, and the Thomas Splint was developed to deal with this. A broken leg in World War I was more dangerous than you might think. Have a look at this picture. Why would transporting a man with a broken leg be dangerous in such a situation? Well, it might not be obvious, but the fact is broken bones, if they're bad enough, have got jagged edges. When shaken and jolted, as would be the case in this stretcher-bearing party, they cut into the flesh inside, internally, and they cause dangerous internal bleeding. 80% of soldiers with broken legs, especially those with compound fractures, died from bleeding and infection when they were being evacuated from the trenches. So in 1916, the Thomas Splint, named after the inventor, was developed and introduced. It pulled the break apart, stopping it rubbing and stopping the internal bleeding. This helped soldiers recover and cut the death rate down from 80% from these wounds right the way down to 20%, a truly stunning improvement. Versions of the Thomas Splint have been used right up to the present day, so it's a device that really works. Although the First World War was in a time before antibiotic medicines existed, there were some new ways of fighting infection. A major problem faced by the Royal Army Medical Corps at the start of the war was dealing with infections caused by gas gangrene. It was not possible to perform aseptic surgery in the dressing stations and casualty clearing stations for two major reasons. Firstly, the contaminated conditions, and secondly, the large numbers of wounded men. New methods had to be found to solve the problems facing medics on the Western Front in this era before antibiotics. The first was wound excision or debridement. We can see examples of this in this Royal Army Medical Corps illustration. This was cutting away the dead, damaged and infected tissue from around the wound to reduce infection. However, this needed to be done quickly as possible to prevent the infection spreading. Otherwise, you just ended up chasing the infection and cutting away more and more and more. After the excision, the wound needed to be closed with stitches, and often antiseptics were used to kill the infection. If any infected tissue had not been removed before the wound was stitched, the infection would spread again, and the process would need to be repeated. That's not all though. There was also the Carroll-Dakin method. Antiseptics such as carbolic lotion were inefficient when treating gas gangrene. By 1917, the Carroll-Dakin method was the most effective alternative. This involved putting sterilised salt solution or saline solution in a wound through a tube. We can see that in these images. The solution only lasted for 6 hours and so had to be made as soon as it was needed. This was a problem if large numbers of soldiers needed treatment, but effectively this sort of irrigation of the wound with sterile salt solution really worked to fight infections. If all else failed though, there was amputation. If neither wound excision nor the use of antiseptics succeeded in halting the spread of infection, the only way to deal with it was through the amputation of wounded limbs. By 1918, 240,000 British soldiers had lost limbs, many of them because it was the only way to prevent the spread of infection and death. So to recap our final points. The specific problems with treating wounds in World War I led to a number of new innovations which would later prove their value in peacetime as well as in war. Firstly, the Thomas Splint drastically reduced deaths from internal bleeding from compound fractures. Remember that figure of 80% of people with broken legs dying before the Thomas Splint and only 20% dying afterwards because of the internal bleeding was being that much reduced. Despite the lack of antibiotic medicines, excision, debridement and the Carroll-Dakin method were all at least partially successful in treating infection. These tended to use a saline solution pumped through the wound in order to sterilise it. And if all else failed, amputation was the last resort. However, it's really worth remembering that in earlier times it would have been the only option, and that would have carried with it its own risks of infection and shock and pain. So surgery in World War I and other medical techniques had really advanced, and I do stress that you remember this is in a time before antibiotic medicines, making it all the more remarkable. That's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please like the video and you can subscribe to the channel for more. If there's something that you're desperate for me to cover, why don't you pop it down in the comments. You could also ask other questions and I'll help if I can. But for now, I'll say thanks very much for watching and goodbye.